mud daub chimney. And this old house, the Neal house, was moved here from where we live up in Rapides Parish. And this is pretty consistent with our Anglo ancestry. Kim and I both, her grandpa and them had a dog trot house. And this old clay chimney, this is, my grandma and them told me about building these cypress pickets. And then all the kids would get together and they'd dig a pit and put clay in it and black moss. They would take the Spanish moss once it had dried and cured so it wouldn't shrink, and roll the moss and mud together in what they call mud cats, and throw it up to the men that had the cypress pickets, and they would daub these chimneys. Mud daub chimney. This is called wattle and daub in English, and in French it'd be called boussillage. But that is old Rapides Parish dog trot house. And this is a sugar mill right here. Build a big old fire in there, and this will be full of sap, cane sap. Scoop like this here, this screen here, that screen has that sap would cook and start frothing up. You got to get the temperature just right because they don't want to burn it. But as it would cook, they take this screen and screen up the foam on the top to skim it up. And this is a sugar mill. My second great grandpa, who was Cherokee from Tennessee, lived in a house like that, and he had a sugar mill like this and some land up in Grant Parish, which is just north of Rapides. This is the cane press for the sugar mill. Those wheels right there. This here would have a long pole going out here and one out there, and have a little donkey or something tied to the ends, and they'd go around and around, and this would turn. When it would turn, these wheels would turn opposite each other. They stick the sugar cane in here, sorghum or sugar cane, and it would squeeze it. It squeezed the cane, and then the juice would pour out of this spout here, and they'd catch the sugar cane juice and then pour it in there and cook it down until they cooked all the moisture out of it, and it was just crystallized brown sugar. Notice how bright it is in here. A whitewash, a lime solution. They whitewashed this lumber, and it served two purposes. One purpose it served was, of course, to brighten the room up, so minimum light's needed to be able to see. But the other reason is it keeps bugs from eating into the wood. It's a type of wood treatment. These are hewn logs. You can see inside and out, and they're battened on the inside with planks, and then the outside was chinked. Chinking is the process of filling this gap. Daubing is what the mud is called. These was a big log. You can tell how big this log was. It would have been a big log. But in this side, you see it's round on top, but this side is flattened out with a broad axe. And then this particular type of joinery is called a half dovetail. And the logs, when they're fit together in such a way, they interlock. And that makes it virtually an indestructible joint. But the other thing is that all the water, as it runs down the logs, is carried away by this chinking on the outside of the logs. Then the water at the joint, every joinery is designed to carry water away from the joint. That's the reason why you can have a building like this standing since 1840 and it's not rotten, because of proper construction technique. Timeless design and proper construction technique. You can see where they've had to replace some of the logs at the top. And they have to replace those with treated because they're sawed pine, whereas the original was hewed. What's the difference? A hewed timber will last longer than a sawed one because you're splitting with the grain. And on a sawed board, you may be exposing end grain with every cut. At any rate, they've had to replace a few. But I'd say in might near 200 years, that's not a bad record. And in Louisiana, in South Louisiana, with a shortage of stone, all of your foundations would have been hewed timber, but it likely would have been white oak or cedar or heart knotted pine. My grandpa's house up in Grant Parish, Louisiana, is sitting on heart knotted pines right now that's not rotten. So that's what you have. Instead of a stone foundation, you have hewed pine or cedar, sometimes cypress, but usually red cedar work better, and white oak is really strong. Stoker barn from Sabine Parish, 1845. I've actually taken, now that tractor obviously ain't from 1845, but that wagon might be. I've taken pictures of some log barns out in that part of the country, probably built about that time. Barn, double pen barn and corn crib. My grandpa's actually got a barn built similar to this, but you'll notice inside here, They've got it planked with hewn slabs, where the slabs that come off when they would be slabbing off the sides of a building with a sawmill. And these are V-notch logs right here. These are solid notches. They're not too complicated to perform. They don't carry the water away as well, but they do carry the water away. But typically in the deep south, when you see V-notches, it's going to be augmented by a wide overhang. So houses in the deep south, and this is a barn, but houses are built in the same way oftentimes. But from the Carolinas, South Carolina, Georgia, Alabama, Mississippi, Louisiana, and parts of Texas, a V-notch like this will have a lot of overhang on the side, so they don't have an issue of water on the joint. And they'll build them oftentimes out of round logs when there's a V-notch. Pioneer house here from That previous house we showed you was East Baton Rouge Parish. This one here's in Franklinton, down in the Florida parishes. That's in the boot down there. Folks lived in this house until from 1810 to 1960. So you can live in one like this and survive it. Let's see here. What we got here? They got the spinning wheel represented here. Early stuff from the colonial period, as well as a safe over there full of mason jars from the 1920s and 30s. So they got a pretty good representation of time span here. Large hewn timber here for this place, sitting on a piece of native sandstone. A lot of the hill country in Louisiana covered in native stone. A little known fact about Louisiana. A crib kept near the bed. This one-room cabin would have raised a family. Here along this you can see a good example of the construction of this mud daub chimney with cypress pickets and sometimes cedar. They'd build it up like that and build a fire in it, and that fire would harden that clay. Fire it just like you'd fire a brick, and it'd get it good and hard. And on the outside you'd have to dabble it every now and again to freshen it up. And there again you see local Louisiana sandstone for a foundation on this place here. And it's built the same way with a hewn timber. Outbuilding here is called a potato house. If you live in a part of the country you can't dig a cellar, you're going to need somewhere thick and insulated and relatively dry and dark. Keep your root crops in so that they last you through the winter. Another outhouse. This little barn, corn crib right out back. Pretty typical of about every farm in Louisiana in the yeoman class. Grandpa's got one like this on his place. I got another video shows it. They got this in here stacked full of tools, but that's nice. It's nice to have the tools. You'd put a bunch of shucked corn in here to keep it through the year. The grain will stay. If you grind it in the mill, it won't last very long. But the grain itself will stay in the kernel for a long time, as long as you keep it dry. And these corn cribs like this, you see this saddle notch on these logs here, and where they cut these trees, they'd have left them like this, or even hewed them this way to keep that end grain from collecting water. Saddle knots don't carry water away from the eave, but you'll notice on all these deep south corn cribs you'll see a large overhang. Round logs and need air to move through there. Need air to be able to move through there. You're going to have an assortment of things trying to get in there. Coons will get in there. Rats will get in the corn, and coons will get in the corn. So for this reason, you'd have to have a dog to keep the coons out of the corn. You have to have a cat to keep the rats out of the corn. And you just take the dry corn and grind it, make meal, grits. Here they built a little makeshift of a cemetery in Louisiana. and all over North Louisiana, up on the Cane River, Natchitoches Parish, where a lot of our family hailed from that were French. You can see a lot of these. In fact, I've posted some on Facebook. But these old iron crosses like this, and they'll have French writing on them and stuff like this. My families first got here in, well, my white family first got here in 1714. My Natchitoches Indian family's been here for, we don't know how long. They're the Caddoan people, but they married into these French. So here is a animal powered grist mill for grinding corn and grain and the bread, in an area down here where you don't have the elevated running water like you do up in the hill country. They'd have to have a way to power this big mill as they poured grain in the top and meal came out the bottom. These belts, so this system here hook horses and mules and things to it, and they walk around in circle and turn it, and that would in turn turn that mill, those two grindstones in there together. See those two grindstones that they rub together and grind corn in the mill. It would sustain people's lives that way. There's another old barn there. Let's go take a look at it. Split cypress barn. These are regular wagon wheels, and those are large wheels, probably off a log wagon. Early bread oven. Fire would be built in there to preheat that little brick oven. And once the fire was built and it got up to temperature, you could remove the fire. Then put your bread in there. Place this lid there. You could make several bacons in there of bread. This house here, there's somebody out there mowing grass, but right out there is a bunch of sunflowers, which is very fitting for these two houses here. This one in particular right here, they call them Acadian style. That's partly correct and partly not. Indeed, these did come from the Acadian parishes. But this is a French style of construction that from Louisiana that predate the Acadians' removal of present-day Nova Scotia. This type of construction here, boussillage construction, typical French from Canada and all the parts of Canada, up in the Illinois country, around the Arkansas post, and in the upper Red River, Natchitoches, Louisiana, where these type of houses were built long before the Acadians came to Louisiana. The first French from Canada were not Acadians, they were French Canadian from Quebec. And that's where our French speaking ancestors hailed from. And you can see that this is mortise and tenon construction. And they leave these walls out so you can see. That's pretty neat. And then they filled them in with boussillage, and that would be a mixture of clay, black moss, and or deer hair. Deer hair was readily available in those days because of the market for deer hunting. French Louisiana was built on the fur trade. You can see how this is some of the earliest type construction. And in here you can see there's deer hair right there. That's actual hair. In this case it might be hog, but I think it's deer. But that's hair and clay. And these pickets are mortised into this beam, and then clay's filled in between. Very strong type of construction. And then the roof would have been your typical shakes. But this type of construction is cool, a lot cooler than a lot more insulation than just regular wood. The field out before here being covered in sunflowers, pretty fitting. Our early French ancestors to Louisiana, and what they call the upper part of the state, which was still lower Louisiana, around Natchitoches, and then later on at Opelousas Post, and like that, were involved in the fur trade with the Indians and married into the Indians, and that's how we got here. Some of our matriarchs were Indian ladies, and our grandfathers, patriarchs, were French traders, and they ranged as far west as sometimes into the southern tip of the Rocky Mountains and as far north as Canada. They had dwellings like this up and down the Red River, where in Natchitoches Parish you can still see evidence of it today. Another example of French construction. Now this is not an original structure. It was built here to replicate how that one over there would have been built originally. A few things to point out that's pretty interesting. The steps on the outside, that's traditional French in this part of the state. This would be the complete size of the house early on. Whitewash with lime. Boussiard's construction, as we pointed out earlier in the previous video. You can see the frame in here. Then pretty much all French Louisiana were devoutly Catholic. They would always have a crucifix in the house somewhere to live in. And these are rope beds. Beds have rope with mosses, with mattresses probably stuffed with Spanish moss. So we've got steps going on the outside. There's obviously, when you look at the size of the house, there's a loft in here, but there's no access to it out here. This was done because of travelers. Someone traveling in the country needing a place to stay for the night could come up here, go up there and spend the night without bothering the rest of the house. And it was also much more easy in a house that size to not have stairs inside the cabin. Shotgun house. Shotgun house of the Deep South, and a split picket fence. Picket fence, even when I was growing up, in the part of Rapides Parish we lived in, they still didn't have a stock law, so cattle were at large. A lot of people would put picket fences like this. They're pointed on top, keep the rain from settling on top of it so it doesn't rot. Shotgun house simply means that it's one room wide and however many rooms deep. In other words, you could open the front door and shoot a shotgun straight through the back door and cover everybody in the house. I was actually born in a hospital, but when I was a baby we lived in a little house similar to this in Grant Parish, Louisiana. it had an outhouse. My grandpa lived in a house like this. Both of them did at some point. And, the one we lived in, I'm sure, was nicer than this on the inside, but it wasn't any bigger than this, maybe one more room. But this represents a kind of standard living for the sharecropper in the Deep South. Which represents a large part of my family history. Back of this shotgun house is constructed with board and batten. That's where you got a solid board on the wall and a batten over the cracks between them. Vertical board and batten is another form of French architecture. This is a Tyrone slave cabin from 1840. Got a stone chimney, mortise and tenon timber frame and construction, only it's got brick on the fore wall and then boussage all the way around. Brick chimney. The rest of the construction is pretty much the same as every dwelling from the period. This one's a little different style, being clappered up, still timber framing, single pin 1840. And this has been a slave's cabin and a sharecropper tenant. My grandpa lived in a house built like this called the Jackson house that belonged to my wife's great-great-grandfather on Black River a long time ago. He said it was one room, built this style, and this is a good description of it right here. It had no porch. It had an overhang but no wooden porch. The chimney, and I think they had built on a little room on the back with a wood cook stove. This is basically the same as the previous two, only with one chimney in the middle with a room on both sides. Double pen house, but with not a dog trot through the center. That one represents one like the aforementioned Jackson house, with an overhang drop, but a double pen, made in two rooms, and the chimney in the center rather than on the gable end. That one over there is much the same way. In this one you can see these mortise and tenon rope beds with mosquito bar. These dowels on the corner, and that mesh represents mosquito bars. And if you live in the Deep South without screens on the windows, you'd understand what mosquito bars were needed for. Oftentimes with a shake roof, cedar shake roof or cypress or wood, whatever it is, oak, rain couldn't come through because it won't run back uphill. But a north wind would blow snow. Snowflakes, being lighter than rain droplets, would blow up under the shakes. And the old timers, and I remember my wife's grandma, Rosalie Crooks from Black River, said that when it would be a cold weather coming, she'd say, "Going to be snow on the bars tonight." that would be it would indicate that they remember a time when snow would blow up under the shakes and wind up on top of the mosquito bar. And you can see they got a kitchen here. The kitchen was always separate from the house. This fire had to go all the time, and if anything burned, they wanted the kitchen to burn without burning the house down. And the chimney was designed to carry the smoke and heat up and not leave it in. Something else to note out here is the gourd at the garden. Garden outside the kitchen have a gourd for martin box. I always encourage purple martins to live near the garden every year because they eat bugs. And it was a natural way of keeping pestilence down to have martins live on the farmstead. Here right outside the kitchen they got of course there's a cistern there. They got a little representation of an herb garden. Things that would have been grown along with the kitchen. Herbs, and as I don't know that they'd have had echinacea. I hadn't researched that. Different things for medicinal, but they might have. But they definitely would have grown a little kitchen garden out, just right out from the kitchen for herbs and spices and things. Here we have a blacksmith shop. Kind of typical blacksmith shop with different periods of history and tools. But at any rate, there's a big coal forge and some pretty impressive anvils. Say so myself. The blacksmith in any community was a very needed craftsman and tradesman. Could create or repair any number of tools or farm equipment, guns, knives, and just things of that nature. But every farm also had usually a small forge. A man, any farmer, homesteader, whatever, may not have been a blacksmith, but he could fire up a charcoal forge and bend something or fix something. Maybe make a butcher knife or something like that. Kind of like a lot of farmers and things today have like a small welder or something. So the blacksmith shop. One thing about these wagon wheels, I had a great grandfather was a wheelwright, and of course, the wooden spokes on the wheel. The spokes are smaller. The wheel is larger than the diameter of the rim, what they call a wagon tire. It's made that way on purpose, and they would heat these rims up really hot on a fire, and they would expand to get larger, and then they would hurry up and hammer them down on that wooden frame and then roll them off into some water, and they'd shrink back up and forever be trying to regain their original size, thus pressing the spokes into the rim. So you could just imagine if it had a rim around it, those spokes would be being pushed into that rim all the time by the pressure of that wagon tire. So that's what keeps it from flying apart. In these stores, in the old days, you'd get your mail. The post office and the commissary is all in the same place. If I'm not mistaken, it wasn't until the Spanish flu epidemic after 1918 that they started with the mail, what was called a rural free delivery, RFD, where they started putting mailboxes out where people could get mail at their own home, because people were staying home because of being quarantined by the flu. Little church. These are still evident all over Louisiana, and little pockets way out of the way. And these good folks from farming class communities, for the lack of money for stained glass, if they managed to get glass in their windows, which would usually come later, you could see where they could paint right on their windows to mimic the stained glass. This is timber framing construction here, also another method of construction. Mortise and tenon with clapboards on the outside. Pretty simple but effective form of construction. Here you can see they got two representations. Got the devil represented on the left, which is pretty ironic, and got an angel's wing and a trumpet represented on the right. And from this position right here, some truly caring and loving country preacher would deliver words of wisdom and worship with as much fervor and understanding as he could possibly gather in his lifetime, and would probably bless the souls of many. Out back here's a cistern. Would have had a gutter and a way for the water to collect in there, and a spigot on the bottom. It didn't necessarily have a well, it had a way to come out here and get water from the cistern. And the outhouse right out here, right out back of the little church. The kids would come screaming out of here, slip out the back to run and hurry and go to this little outhouse. Still being able to sit, maybe making noise that they hoped the church was loud enough that it couldn't be heard. But all throughout the South you could hear that bell up there ring when there was needed. Maybe sometimes a school in here, but no doubt people worshiping and the little minister advancing the kingdom of God. Here's a pretty good representation of a whole lot of early Louisiana. In our family, primarily, they were commercial fishermen and hunters, trappers and traders. Used to fish, and these even made them out of oak. Fish swimming through those flues and get trapped in there.